Okay. It's now the last session on Thursday in the twilight of IETF 117. Welcome to the HTTP session. We have just an hour today. We have a fairly tight agenda, so let's get into it. We have a scribe. Thank you, Travis. I'm not going to display the note well because it does strange things to my machine to share a screen. But hopefully by now in this point of the week, you're all familiar with the IETF note well, which talks about things like what appropriate behavior is, harassment procedures, intellectual property procedures, and so forth. They are important policies, so if you're not familiar with them, please search for IETF note well in your favorite internet search engine. As some people I can see are doing, thank you very much. Please log into this session so that we have a record of who's here. You can do that by scanning the QR code on the screens and following the directions. You have to log into the data tracker and so forth. We also should have a physical blue sheet that allows you to do that, but I don't see it anywhere. Oh, there it is. If folks could pass that around, that'd be great. Thank you, Jonathan. Fantastic. Excuse me. So our agenda for today, we are talking about things that are not yet adopted drafts in this group. That's the entirety of the agenda. And first, we'll talk about secondary certificate authentication for HTTP servers, which is a topic we've had drafts actually active in the group about before, but we've parked them, and this is shaving that down to be maybe a little more manageable, so we'll talk about that. We have a compression dictionary transport draft, which again is a topic we've talked about before, and we're returning to it. So we'll have a discussion of that. And then we have a discussion of HTTP availability hints, which is another tilt at a problem we've tried before. We have a theme for the day, I just realized. So we'll go through that. And finally, no, there are at the end two new things, two new drafts, which have not been discussed before in any form at all. So, although one of them is actually quite, never mind. You get the point.
We do have one talk from last time that we didn't get to. Do we want? And so depending on time availability, we can bash that in.
I think so.
Yeah, let's try to aim for that.
Well, first of all, Siobhan, yes?
She is here.
Oh, good. Lovely. Okay. We'll try and do that then.
Great.
All right. Let's get started. Secondary certificates.
Eric, please come up. And you can request permission to share slides. We can approve it. Yep. You're granted. Oh.
Which is I just like click something.
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Just scroll down until you find yours. Great. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Put your exported authenticator enthusiast hats on, because today we are going to be talking about an individual draft authored by myself and Mike Bishop, secondary certificate authentication of HTTP servers. So for some background, for those of you who have not read the draft, or maybe have, but this is based on an older draft that the working group has previously discussed, that being secondary certificate authentication for HTTP2. I will go over the main differences between this draft and the other one in a few minutes, but as a sort of summary of what this draft is essentially discussing, TLS exported authenticators, which are RFC 9261, allow the ability to send and receive X509 certificates at the application layer. The proposal that is being made for this draft is defining support for HTTP2 and HTTP3 servers, specifically, to send secondary certificates to clients and make themselves authoritative for additional origins. And the way that we essentially do that is a new frame type on stream 0 or the control stream that carries the exported authenticators. And I'll give the obligatory, this doesn't work for HTTP1, so we're just going to pretend that H1 doesn't exist. So to better illustrate kind of how this works, I've put two diagrams that sort of show, the sort of flow that you can kind of expect using exported authenticators in this way. In this case, we have a client connecting to server.example, and server.example is, this server is also authoritative for server1.example and server2.example. Rather than including those origins in the initial certificate on the initial TLS handshake, we can see that after we make a GET request, the server decides that it wants to send these unprompted certificates out prior to sending the OK, and then the client, assuming that it trusts those certs, it can then make a GET request out to one of those origins.
Jonathan.
Doesn't the server need to also send an origin frame?
So the HTTP or the origin spec would suggest that you would send an origin frame, and one of the things that I probably should have done for these diagrams is actually include an origin frame being sent, and also discuss in more detail usage of the origin frame in the actual draft. So that is something that will be kept in mind.
So yeah, either include the origin frame or include the IP DNS check. That I think is the requirement.
Thank you. Mike.
Mike Bishop. So technically, maybe not. To get around the DNS check, you probably want something, although in the updated version drafts of HTTP, we say that authority is established by the certificate, and anything else is browser's choice as to how to decide whether to trust it. But let's get the certificate first.
Okay. So as a reminder, we're talking about adoption here. So let's not get too much into details because we are time constrained.
Yep.
Very well.
So this is a more interesting use case, which is maybe new, that I will get into, or I will explain here. What you can do with this mechanism as well is that you can actually integrate this with forward proxy. So we kind of have like a hybrid proxy scenario where we have a proxy that is both a forward proxy and a reverse proxy. So in this case, we have a relay which forwards requests to server.example, but caches or reverse proxies server1.example and server2.example. So we can see we send a connect request. The relay sends a certificate for the origins that it can serve directly. And so when we make a request out to one of those origins, we can actually send a GET directly. So why do we want this? Well, connection reuse is important. This helps servers that host content from multiple origins. Obviously, instead of sending like gigantic cruise liner certificates that contain a whole boatload of origins, they can much more granularly control the set of origins that they actually support. This is useful for reverse proxies as well, obviously, and sort of elaborating on this, we have this hybrid proxies example where you can have forward proxies like mask, which can actually also reverse proxy a subset of origins for performance and load balancing benefits. There's also a privacy and security angle here. So one use case that can be imagined there is that servers could make particular origins only accessible for certain users. You could combine this with client authentication mechanisms like, unprompted auth, which is also, in the works with the working group to essentially, make it so that origins are only accessible or even visible to already authenticated users, like users who are in the know and not excluded. So that is a interesting, maybe useful, maybe not use case. But so what has changed? Why are we talking about this again? A few things have changed. Firstly, the previous draft only defined support for H2, which is understandable. H3 wasn't entirely around. So this draft defines support for H2 and H3. Importantly, this draft only includes support for unprompted server authentication. We've scoped down this draft pretty significantly based on implementation to kind of reduce the sort of complexity. My understanding with the old draft is that one of the reasons it wasn't able to make it through was because it ended up being overly complex. So it seems like we want to be careful about scoping this too far. If we wanted to standardize it, maybe split things out into multiple drafts or RFCs if it was desired to standardize other mechanisms that were related to exported authenticators. Exported authenticators are also now an RFC. They weren't before, back when the draft was last being worked on, which helps. So it's more mature. And there's implementation interest. Apple has recently been exploring uses for this mechanism as far as it pertains to relays and reverse proxies.
How many more slides do you have? Should I wait to the end?
Probably.
Okay.
So I was going to just kind of give a preview of some of the open issues here, and I'm just going to run over these sort of relatively quickly, and if there are any that are interesting to discuss, then we can sort of discuss them afterward. But because this has not yet been formally adopted by the working group, I thought I would just run over them. There's been some debate about the settings parameter, whether it is needed. The draft currently defines a settings parameter to advertise support for this mechanism. The new frame type would be dropped by non-supported clients as far as like if, there's not necessarily an issue with sending a certificate to a client that didn't know about it from that perspective. We've discussed also renaming the certificate to server certificate if that reduces confusion, especially if client authentication ends up coming back into the fray, but maybe as a separate draft, there would be less confusion there. There is a good reason to have a setting, which is that servers might want to behave differently for connections that are not known to support the mechanism. There's this case where, clients that use origin frames to scope coalescing that don't know about certificate frames might drop them and then be looking at an origin frame that contains a name that they've never seen before. So, might not be a huge problem, but it is just something that, might be worth considering. Another issue that has been discussed is client prompting certificates from the server rather than just unprompted certificates from the server. This ends up adding a lot of complexity. There are some good reasons for it, mainly that origin frames have like less overhead and more clear semantics, but it's likely most servers that would be doing this would be sending both an origin frame and a secondary certificate. But the amount of complexity and like potential like privacy concerns that this introduces may make it better as a separate discussion and not to derail this work. And then the last sort of main open issue right now, this is like less of a discussion point, is that the draft is currently H3 centric. Most of the experimentation has been done with HTTP3, and as a result, the frame size limits of H2 kind of ended up as a sort of afterthought, but we will, like exported authenticators end up being large enough that it would be necessary for over H2 to send them in multiple frames, meaning that there does need to be a mechanism to sort of gather the authenticator fragments. There are a number of different ways that can be done. One of them was to reintroduce a certificate ID, which you could use to sort of correlate multiple fragments coming in. The cert ID could be useful for some other things, like if there are weird schemes where the server and client both need to be in full agreement about which certificate is used for a request response, that you could use a cert ID, but just worth considering there. So closing up here, having a clear focus on, I think, the unprompted server authentication is a good starting point to help us get the ball rolling, partially because now there is actual implementation interest, and there are now existing clients and servers which are capable of doing this. I'm thinking that as far as managing the scope of work like this, it would make more sense to kind of drive this based on actual implementation experience and to determine what works and what doesn't work. So with that, the final remark is that this work is looking for adoption in HTTPBIS.
So before Jonathan, we are time constrained. We have about 2 minutes left on this, so let's focus discussion on adoption, not the details.
Very good.
Please.
So I'm obviously pushing in the other direction. I want to get this working for clients as well. So there's definitely interest. Sorry, Jonathan Hoyden Klappler. There's definitely interest from both sides, as in doing the client stuff and doing the server stuff. I do agree that we should try and keep the scope as simple as possible. But I think getting rid of the client stuff would be annoying. Could we have the slides back again? Sorry.
Keep talking.
You said something about certificate ID. Why doesn't that just link to the certificate request context, or how you populate the certificate?
Does this affect whether we adopt it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Whether it's a good idea or not. And then, yeah, okay. And then can you go back one slide again?
We can revise that later.
Yeah, it's being adopted as a starting point, not
Okay.
all the ideas.
Yeah.
Do we want to revive second?
I want to do this, but only if we can include client-side stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will say I do think that there is an argument to be made to do client certs in a separate document, just because there's no reason why these mechanisms cannot be separated between server and client
Yeah.
authentication.
Alessandro Gadini, Cloudflare. We were interested last time around. We actually implemented and deployed the old drafts, and then nobody used it, but we're still interested. And there's the new mask sort of use case now, which is also sort of interesting for us as well.
Mike Bishop with a process question for the chairs. We already adopted secondary certificates. It was moved to dead, but does that mean it needs to be adopted again, or is this really just reviving the existing draft?
I think we'd want to see significant interest in the group before trying again.
Right.
Yeah.
Watson Lad Akamai, I think this is a good idea. I implemented it last time at an older job. I think it's still good. Let's move it forward.
Cool.
Do you want to hum or just take the list?
We can do a quick show of hands, I think, yeah.
Lucas is also went into the queue.
What should it be?
Am I allowed to speak or no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Lucas. Hi. I support it. Let's do it.
One of the questions we probably should think about is there was this kind of level of interest before, but it failed to actually take off. We didn't get implementation, especially from clients. So
We've heard interest from server side. If we got any interest from the browser side?
yes, that's the good question. So Tommy has put in a poll. If you're interested in adopting this as a starting point for reviving secondary certificates, raise your hand. If you're not, please do not raise your hand. And if you have no opinion, you don't have to do anything. Okay, so we see significant numbers raising hands. We see a few saying no. If any of the folks who did not explicitly raise their hand there, if you'd like to say why you don't think we should adopt this, that would be helpful. Anyone? Okay. Martin.
I didn't go either way, but I would like to see a little more time spent just clarifying exactly what the use cases are on this one and making sure that we're confident that we don't need something more than what's in here. So
I think we should continue the discussion.
a little bit of discussion on that, because there was a lot of back and forth about whether we have requests for these things, how they're linked into requests, and all those sorts of other things. It may just be very, very simple, which would be great, but I'd like just a tiny bit more clarity on that before we just jump into adoption.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
And for the notes, that was 20 and 20 raised and 4 did not. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Let's move on. Patrick. You want to share your own slides?
Just do next slide.
Okay.
Oh, yes, I can grant it.
Make the request. Yeah.
Now I'm wishing I had my glasses. Great. And I feel a little bit like Wile E. Coyote standing on the X, but
Alrighty, so this is another attempt at using shared compression dictionaries history on a connection for compressing future requests. Previous attempts, we've tried this at least 2 or 3 times so far. They've all failed on the privacy and security boundaries and leaking information across privacy boundaries that mostly browsers cared about. But I think hopefully we have a solution to that now. The main use cases that we're targeting right now are a previous version of a resource being used as a dictionary for a future version. Say the YouTube JS player, for example, it's a version JS file at some path, updates a few times a week, can be used as a dictionary if you've already downloaded it for a compressed version of another version of the file at a new URL. But all negotiated with the client and the client cache for people that have already visited. And if you want to build a custom dictionary for your either HTML pages or JS API that has all of the common template stuff in it, you can sideload a dictionary as part of your navigation that can then be used in future requests for that type of content. So it has 2 parts. This first part's kind of optional in the actual compression scheme, but the way a resource is advertised as being available to be used as a dictionary for future requests is it gets a use as dictionary response header on the initial request, and it includes a few things as structured field params. Probably the most important one is a match that gives you an URL pattern. For the types of requests that are same origin that the dictionary was served from that can use this dictionary for future requests if the client so chooses. It also has a time to live for how long the dictionary is allowed to be used for, independent of the cache lifetime of the resource, in case you want to have minimize the variants that are out there for your caches. And then there's another optional one, which is the hash algorithms that are supported by the origin for the hashes that can be advertised for the dictionaries. The hashes and the reason will be coming up. The client, so once the client has a dictionary that it thinks it can use for a given request, either pre-negotiated out of band if you have a native client or something like that, or if you're just calling APIs, or if you had a use as dictionary request that came from a previous session that you've got on disk somewhere, the client advertises a dictionary, a single dictionary that it would like to use for the given request in a sec available dictionary header, and it passes the hash, currently a SHA-256 hash, of the contents of the dictionary that it has available on the request, so that if the server has a matching hash for the dictionary or a version of the resource that was already compressed with that dictionary, it can just serve that one as a delta instead of serving the full resource. We currently have 2 encodings that we've extended for Brotli and Z standard. We just, we're really creative. We added a -D to the end of the content encoding for each of those. It's not limited to those 2. Those are the only ones that we have that we know of right now. We're anticipating at some point in the future code-aware, WASM-aware compression schemes that can do better delta compression than just using Brotli or Z standard. And this is flexible because it just really negotiates the dictionary itself. The compression is negotiated separately. And so if the server has the hash, either for a dynamic compression dictionary or a static resource already compressed, it just says, it uses the content encoding for the type of compression it used, either Brotli or Z standard. And really importantly, it adds a vary on the accept encoding and sec available dictionary to make sure that there's no cache collisions for the resource and serving delta encoded resources to clients that can't understand it. The main things that we've sort of negotiated and worked around here is that the privacy protections are all client managed instead of trying to do it at a transport protocol transparently. The client has to decide that it wants to use a dictionary for a given request. And in the browser case, at least, all of the dictionaries are partitioned with caches and cookies. They're assumed to be private information that belongs to the session and the partition that the browser is currently navigating within. They're cleared whenever cache or cookies are cleared. And probably most importantly, they're only used for non-opaque requests. We are assuming that an Oracle attack will be able to reveal the contents of something that's delta encoded. So we're just going to completely ignore that and say we're only going to use it when you can read the contents of the response anyway, which happens to work out in most of the cases that we want to use it for anyway. We can mostly do this entirely on the client side, where the client just won't bother requesting dictionary compression if it knows it's going to be an opaque request. The one exception to that is, sort of the bane of our existence, CORS. We had to leak CORS into this a little bit. For servers that are concerned about maybe accidentally leaking some private information, the server must not send or use dictionary compression when it sees a CORS request and the access control allow origin response header either doesn't match the origin or isn't a wildcard, which means it's probably going to be an opaque request when it hits the client. We'll still do blocking on the client side and we'll fail the request, but there is a chance that a timing attack could still happen if the server doesn't fail these requests or just not use a dictionary in these cases. So I tried to keep it as clean from browser stuff as possible and try and keep it as much protocol level as possible while still solving the security and privacy issues we've had before. Practically, this is going in a form of this. I think we've used different content encodings into an origin trial in Chrome in 1.17 to see the developer feedback and see how well it works with developer workflows. We think we've got something that works relatively well. The JS deltas, they can just build at build time against prior versions of their JS libraries and have the artifacts already ready. The dynamic compression, we've got tools that can build dictionaries off of a wide selection of URLs, so hopefully. And we have a few internal clients. We're working on external clients as well, just to make sure. But yes, largely, we think it's something exciting. We think it belongs in this working group. We're hoping to get the group to adopt it and then bike shed on the details.
All right. Thank you. So we have talked about this before. We had reservations before. I guess the question is, how does the group feel about this now? So Martin, you're in queue.
Yeah, this looks like good work. We're supportive of at least finding out how well it works with developers and whether or not it fits in with workflows. I think the Delta thing seems pretty obviously easy to integrate into various workflows. I'm a little bit more nervous about the other one, particularly with some of the details like pattern matching and what have you. I don't really want pattern matching in the stack, if at all possible. I think we did prefix matching in some places already, so maybe that's better. But we can talk about that in terms of details once we get into the discussions in the working group. I think the right way to proceed here is we can adopt this. We see how the trials that you're running turn out. And then at that point, we can make a firmer decision as to whether or not we can continue and how we proceed with it. But I don't see any objection to moving this in here.
So to be clear, you're not suggesting that we gate adoption on the trial, the feedback from the trials?
No, I think this is one of those ones where it at least intuitively, there's at least something in here that will be very, very useful. There's the part that we're not sure about. I wouldn't want to ship anything until we were very certain, but of course, that's not how we operate here, so I think we're okay.
All right.
And the reason we're doing an origin trial is we can shut it down and get rid of anything that existed in case it didn't work.
Alan from Dell Meta. I'm relaying a comment from Felix, my colleague. He says, I just wanted to voice my support for the compression dictionary transport and add that I intend to implement it at Meta since the addition of wildcards makes it compatible with our URI scheme for static resources.
Alessandro Ghedini, Cloudflare. Also interested in adopting and working on this. We've done some work in the past in this sort of general area. I guess also like what Martin said, like we need to figure out some, but it's probably a good place to start.
Lucas. Lucas Pardew. I've been like following this work that hasn't been presented here before, like the stuff you've been doing, and made some comments on the draft and the shape of the headers and all these kind of things. I think the separation that you have from what belongs in this group and what is not in this group is correct. And if it isn't done here, then maybe you'll just go and try and do it elsewhere. And I think this group is the right place that has the expertise. There are some thorny edges we really should consider. And yeah, I think this is good, but I have some reservations about some aspects that are probably completely resolvable if we give it the time and focus that it needs.
Yeah, I will say in the main proposal in what WG, there are a few pieces that are like HTML browser specific, like how do you trigger a side load of a dictionary to be used for HTML and things like that, that didn't feel appropriate for here, that we will do in like the fetch and HTML specs.
That's very normal, I think. But what I like is it appears that this is usable by other uses of HTTP without having to rely upon that. So, okay. Any other comments? Okay. So I thank you, because I know that a lot of people are very interested in the potential performance wins here, and it seems like you found a way to unblock the concerns that potentially were
I
in
hope
there.
so. And we've
I hope
gone
so,
through
yeah.
2 or 3 internal privacy and security reviews, and they haven't crapped on it yet, which is kind of a first for one of these. Doesn't mean no one will discover an attack that we haven't seen, but we're hoping that just by ignoring the attackable content, we'll be okay.
Okay. Do we want to do a hum, or I mean, okay? How do I do that? Oh wow, that's okay.
Say while he's typing really quickly on the pattern matching, we've seen cases where like the version of resources are in the middle of the path, and then you have like main.js or whatever at the end of the path, which is why we kind of needed at least a wildcard in the middle. I'm trying to avoid going full URL pattern, which is a browser thing that has regexes and all of that kind of thing. So right now the spec just has a wildcards on, or asterisks only in certain places, and as simple as possible. But anyway, Mark's a quick typer.
9th grade typing class. Okay. We seem to be getting good numbers that are raising steadily, and I don't see any do not raise hands yet, so that's notable. My inclination would be to take it to the list and do a call for adoption, but we can talk about that and
awesome.
Coordinate with you. Yeah, thank you very much.
27-0.
Yeah, 27-0 and 1 minute exactly remaining. Impressive. Okay. How do I? That stopped. All right. Yep. Share preloaded slides. How do I stop the previous ones in this new? Oh, okay. I'm just gonna sit up here if you don't mind. This is me, not chair. So hi. So I'm going to talk a bit about a draft that I had on the agenda last time, but we ran out of time. Availability hints. There we go. So I don't think this is a surprise. Vary is one of the most lamented, hated, misunderstood mechanisms in HTTP. I maintain that as specified, it is not impossible to implement, but impractical to implement, because it requires you to examine every stored response for a given URI to tell what the right response to return is for a given request. And proxy caches, maybe a browser cache can do that. I don't know. Their performance is meh. But proxy caches, that's just no way, not going to happen. So you have a lot of heuristics, you have a lot of invention, and a lot of drift in how different implementations handle vary. And that's not good, especially as we have things like client hints using vary more, and we want to encourage use of variation more. So, I can't press space. There we go. So our first try to address this was the key draft, And that was Roy and I. And we had this idea that you could actually have a little language in a response header that explained how to create a cache key for all responses with that URI. And that went on for a little while. Excuse me. And what we kind of came to was the place that whilst this was very flexible and had that kind of attractive, deterministic look, you just use this recipe to create a key, it was really complicated, it was really awkward, and it was kind of a foot gun for people running websites because they had to get it right. And if they didn't get it right, it could break pretty spectacularly. Also, it was awkward because you had to fit this little language into all the different HTTP headers, keeping in mind this was before structured headers. So we didn't have that kind of, or even before retrofit, we didn't have that way to talk about the structure of headers that we might have now. Our second attempt was variants, which is now a parked or dead, I think we parked it, draft. And this took a different approach. This was saying that responses would describe the different axes that they varied on and what the different availabilities were, so that you could kind of construct by following an algorithm what the right thing to serve for any given request was based on its knowledge, the cache's knowledge of what was available. So this was much less foot gunny, I think that's a word, and more declarative, which is kind of nice. But the cache has to know about the individual header semantics, and you have to build into the cache. Oh, here's accept encoding. Here's all the different ways you can vary something, which there aren't that many. It's growing, so that's questionable how onerous that is. But it still is kind of complex and non-intuitive, and you have to have these kind of weird variants and variant key headers. So I'm going to try again. I've talked to people about this in the background a lot, and what's nice about this new approach is availability hints is kind of extremely intuitive. It's just listing for each axis of variation what your available representations are on the origin server. And then a cache can use that to figure out whether it needs to go back to the origin server or it can serve something from cache based on the client's preferences. And the nice thing is that information is actually useful for other things too. People have other use cases for describing what the different representations along a given axis are. There's one kind of degradation here as opposed to variance, in that it doesn't contain information about relative preference between different axes. So, if you have a gzipped French versus a Brotlead English, it's hard to express a preference between those two. But you do have a way to express things like what the default representation if no preferences are set, which is nice. So I've talked to people about this. We talked a little bit on the list. I still think it needs some development. It's still a bit hand-wavy, but I think it's more promising at this point than what we've talked about before, which to me says maybe it's time to make it our most recent attempt at this, and hopefully third time's a charm. So what do folks think? I know that's inspiring confidence there, I know. Nothing. I know. It's not time yet. So I think this is, I guess maybe the other question to ask is, I think this is a fairly important problem to solve. Vary is awful. The question is, is this an interesting approach? Alessandro
Guedini, Cloudflare. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, the problem is there and we probably should solve it. It's just, I haven't, I'm not like a HTTP expert about, and so I don't know that this is the right solution. I guess we can try and then see what happens. I don't know.
That's kind of where I'm at. Yeah.
Chris Lemons, Comcast. This problem is really important. It would be really good to solve it. The solution looks marginally better than the previous two. I think it's probably technically possible to implement it, which is, a good thing. I would also like to see where this work goes.
Mike? No? No mic? Okay. Sorry? Same thing? I think my feelings are not necessarily different than those expressed. I think I'm kind of wanting to give it a try, but I'm not confident that the outcome is going to be great. But, you know, if we don't try, it's, you know, never going to get fixed. So maybe take it to the list. Yeah.
Yeah, we can take it to the list. I'm happy to get a sense of the room as well, since we have time. So raise your hand if you believe that third time's a charm, or rather, if we should adopt availability hints as something we should discuss and work on in this group. Give another 20 seconds. Let people open Meet Echo on their phones. Yeah, okay. Seems stable. Got one do not raise hand. Happy to hear from that person if they'd like to speak.
Yeah, I'm just not very happy with the idea that we keep swinging and missing on this one.
Right, so you don't believe in third time's a charm.
I don't know. Well, I guess what I'm saying is that I'd like to see a little more evidence that this one's going to work.
If I can respond to that, I agree.
And it was pretty lukewarm here.
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
Yeah, I would. It's easier to try and gather that evidence when you have a little bit of momentum, not a lot, but a little bit, and adoption is one way to do that. There's also I've had, and I apologize, I didn't do my homework for the slides, but I know some folks in the Chrome team have other use cases for this kind of information. That if we standardize the headers, it's still useful to them.
A clear signal of support from a clear signal of support from a browser or a client of some sort would be significant here.
No, a cache.
Yes, right.
Not a client.
Okay, cache, whatever. Yeah. Yes, there are lots of caches out here. I didn't hear much from them, and I didn't hear much from the client-side caching people either. So
yeah, I don't think we took two swings and misses. I think we took two swings and learned.
I mean, yeah. I mean, if you're shooting in the dark, and you don't hear it, you go, well, I won't shoot there again. But
boy, it's dark in there, isn't it, Thompson? Yeah.
I think we're getting closer, but I don't know, and I'd like to see just more enthusiasm. That's all.
I mean, to that point, it seemed like people were interested in having this as a starting point from a document standpoint, but for implementations, I guess, like if you are a client or cache and you would be interested in experimenting with this as we are developing it, could you raise your hand? Okay, you'll try it, Mark. Okay.
I mean, like, I've been talking to the
yeah.
I've been talking to the Cloudflare cache team about this. They're interested in it, but you know, do I have it on their implementation schedule yet? No.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, for them, it's like three people.
Okay. I mean, the most optimistic thing I can say right now is that this is kind of in the same state that early hints was when Kazuho first talked about it. It was like, oh yeah, that seems like a good idea, but I'm not going to implement anytime soon. And yeah, oh, now Kazuho is going to talk to prove me wrong. But yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. That's good. Close deck. No. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can make this quick. So I also wanted to talk about a couple of caching specs that I've been working on in the background for a while and talking to a lot of folks about. No, I can't press space. So first I want to motivate this and all the work that I'm doing here. A large reason why I worked on things like targeted cache control and CDN loop and some other things was I believe CDNs and reverse proxies should be a targetable platforms, so that people, content folks, and especially content management systems, origin servers, people running sites, can target them and know how they're going to interact with it. So that, for example, Drupal or WordPress or any other kind of content management system can be configured to use a CDN without having to have a CDN specific plugin. And that creates a nice symbiosis and makes the ecosystem more viable, I think. And so I think the next steps in doing that are a couple of different things. The first is this thing called cache groups. It's often useful to group stored responses in cache together for different purposes. One of them is invalidation. So, if more than one resource incorporates common information, it's useful to invalidate them together. So for example, the one I have here, when a famous person dies, you invalidate all the pages referring to them so that they get freshened so you don't have stale information out in cache, in your reverse caches. Or you might want to invalidate a lot of things that share properties, but they don't share a common URI prefix. That allows you to structure your site in a more sensible way, so you don't have to think about invalidation when you're structuring your URIs. This is very common now. At least these 3 CDNs support this pattern. Cloudflare uses the cache tag header. Fastly uses the surrogate key header, and I gotta love the use of that word surrogate from 2000, which kind of died back then. That's great. I'm happy to see it come back. And Akamai has edge cache tag. And so the proposal is, and there's a new thing in the proposal as well, which is invalidation by group. So sometimes resources are so tightly bound together that successfully revalidating one might imply that others are fresh too. So the kind of use case here is maybe JavaScript libraries. You deploy them as a lot of resources, but when they get refreshed, they all get refreshed together, and that saves you a lot of traffic. This is much more optimistic, I guess, or tentative than the previous use case. The previous use case is very much paving cow paths. This is, I think, something we'd need to sketch out and make sure we're comfortable with it. But it's interesting to think about other uses of grouping besides just invalidation. And so that's just a new header, basically. The second capability is an invalidation API. And so plenty of CDNs and reverse proxies excuse me, have invalidation APIs. And here's a list of some of them that I found just with a very brief search. It's just an HTTP endpoint that you send a request to, and the cache gets invalidated. So again, the proposal here is to just have one way to do that, that we support a variety of different selectors for how you tell the service what you're invalidating, but it creates some commonality between behavior, between all those things. And that's, to me, the value here is not quite so much in having a single syntax on the wire of how I invalidate things, because of course you can write clients for different invalidation APIs. The value here is in aligning what invalidation means and how it works, and the conceptual alignment between CDNs is the interesting outcome here. And third, this is currently in that second draft, but I think it might want to be split off separately, is this idea of gateway description. And the use case here is that to use a CDN with a CMS, you have to tell the CMS certain things about how the CDN is behaving. And of course, CDNs behave in different ways still. As much as we want to align them, they have different behaviors and different things that they support. And so the idea here is, why don't we describe the CDN to the CMS and come up with a file format that allows you to say, okay, go to my CDN dashboard, pluck a file out of it, feed it into my CMS, and configure that CMS for the CDN that I'm using, and make that a more automated process. And it opens a new communication channel where we can get more fine-grained about how the CDN is going to treat the responses from that CMS. And so here's some examples. I think hopefully this is just a starting point, but that's the idea there. And this is what it might look like if you're just using JSON, for example. And so this gives you a way, for example, targeted cache control. We allowed the creation of other targeted cache control headers, like CDN-specific ones. This would allow you to communicate back to the CMS which ones you support and what their precedence is, so it can take advantage of that. And so that's it. I've talked to a number of CDN folks about this, both at my employer and other CDNs. I would characterize the responses as that looks interesting. We're not sure that we can implement it yet. It depends on customer, demand. It depends on things like that. I've talked to folks at CMSs, and they are very interested, and they're very skeptical that CDNs will adopt it. So I'm hoping to get customers and CMSs to pressure them into doing it, to be frank, because I think it's good for the ecosystem. I think it's actually good for the CDNs. Responses.
Hey, Lucas Pardew. Maybe I had a Fox Mulder moment where I lost a minute or something because it was like one thing.
Sorry, can you get a bit closer to the mic?
Yeah, sorry. It was like one thing, and then suddenly at the end, it was a structured way for describing some stuff about CDNs.
Yes.
Are those not two different things, or
this is three different things?
Okay. What's the adoption question? Like some of that.
Which ones are you interested in?
Well, the last one seems really easy. Like I can't see people going, I object to putting some information in JSON and
don't give them ideas then.
But I don't know. Like, there's too many things going on, and it's late in the week. So that's all I got to say. I don't know what you're asking me, but I got opinions on all of them, but none of them. Whatever.
I think for the comments here, in interest of time, like I don't think we're asking like, are we adopting these particular documents now? It's like, what are you interested in working on? We want to just gauge the feeling tone of the room.
And for me, the more interesting discussion now is this idea of CDNs and reverse proxies as a targetable platform something that we as a community are interested in, and do we want to push towards that? These are my ideas of how to get there. I'm sure there are others.
So, sorry, can I just respond quickly then?
Of course.
I think the last thing is good, and separable from the other stuff, and maybe something worth looking more into.
Okay. Yeah, these are three separate pieces, to be clear. Yeah. Sorry for not making that more clear. Chris?
So number 2, very, very interested, although it wasn't entirely clear to me where that API is supposed to be, if there's some sort of an expectation that it's supposed to be on every cache, whether it's supposed to be on some centralized system for the collection of intermediaries. That was less clear to me than it could have been. Number 3 is also very interesting, and it is, I'm gonna have to read it a lot more carefully to know for sure, but it looks very, very similar to some of the work that is coming out of the CDNI working group. And that probably doesn't completely surprise you. I don't know. But there is some of that self-describing interop type things. But these are spelled very differently, and their goals may be sufficiently distinct.
And for interest of time, I like to cut the queue here and just let's be quick on the comments and just mainly about interest levels.
Rich Sauls, Akamai. As you expect, yeah, this is interesting. Did you speak to CDNs other than the ones who have employed you?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So, all right, for purpose of time, I think number 1 is the most interesting and the easiest one because you just have to put an adapter in front of your existing APIs. So, sure. And the others are okay too, but number 1 seems the most interesting and easy to do.
Sorry, you mean the invalidation API?
Yes.
Yeah, that's number 2, but okay.
Okay. Oops.
No worries.
Mike?
Mike Bishop, Akamai. I will echo it sounds interesting. Also, implementation experience. We are probably going to need customers to ask for this before it happens. So yes, please bring customers that want to use it. I kind of see the last one as like the config file is telling you where to find common elements that you expect from each CDN. And the more common CDN things that have already been defined, the more valuable it becomes.
I agree. I just say that the other purpose of the config file is to allow CDNs to differ because they are going to differ for a while. And so if we can describe that, that's useful.
Right. So you've already got the targeted cache control headers. I think the more other pieces that get defined, the more valuable that config file is going to become.
We've had a bunch of Akamai folks and no Fastly folks.
Oh, yeah, actually.
Piotr Sikora, Aviatrix. So first, the cache tags thing is fine. I think it's interesting and definitely should be adopted. The second and third thing, it's almost like out-of-bound API, right? So I'm not sure if that's HTTP working group or maybe CD, NI or whatever. Although I would also like to see a way to target gateways or other intermediaries in protocol in band for different use case. But that would be interesting to see.
Eric Nygren, Akamai. I think the conceptually at the highest level, it's intriguing. I think I'll echo what others have said is like some of it will really need customer demand, but I think there's a bigger issue I worry about is that since some of these we're looking at mapping concepts onto kind of multiple large systems that have been existing for a while, that at the surface level, some of these things may be similar, but a lot of the devils and the details are going to be really different. Like you take something like the cache groups and how people deal with what are those namespace to, like probably have very fundamentally different implementations that kind of ripple across. Or similarly, when you actually do a URI, a purge of an individual URL, what that might mean in terms of if you have configuration that does rewrites and flexible cache keys and dynamic config and edge logic is going to be dramatically different. And some of the complexity there might start getting past the edge of what we may necessarily want to deal with. And it may be that like at the surface, it seems simple, and then you get into the details and everything unravels and it becomes a lot harder than it seems.
Yeah, I'm super aware of that from talking to customers and looking at the things. And I've started to try and accommodate that in the drafts. It has a lot further to go. You need to walk that line really carefully. I agree.
Marco Munisaga. As an individual and the user of CDNs, this seems great. Yeah.
Should I try again?
Yeah, start.
Okay, cool. Hey all, Shivan Sahib, work for Brave Browser. Oh, cool, it's working. Yeah, just there's a new HTTP response header that we are shipping support for in the browser. So just wanted to get folks' opinion on whether there's interest and whether HTTP working group is the right place for it. Yeah, so this is the threat model. Essentially, the attacker. Sorry. That's all right. The attacker we're trying to protect against is a local attacker who has authenticated access to the browser because browsers collect so much information. So it's in academic literature, it's called a UI-bound adversary. This is often used in intimate partner violence, like discussion on that. So yeah, just what's in scope is things like browsing history, URL, autocomplete, cookies. What's not in scope is network snooping, spyware, stuff like that. And what the attacker is trying to do is identify if the victim has been to a sensitive website, and the victim is trying to hide that. And the sensitive here is defined as what the website self-reports as. Next slide. But I guess essentially, as I mentioned, the two main use cases were yeah, intimate partner violence, because browsers are a pretty major attack vector. And also the other one is law enforcement or someone coming up to you and saying, okay, give over your phone. So you don't have advanced knowledge that this might happen, but you're still trying to protect it. Next slide. That's essentially what it looks like. It's a structured field header sent by the website, and the client just indicating that the server wants the client to not leave any trace of the website's interactions around. Next slide. Yeah, this is just what it looks like in Brave. We can skip this part. There's a consent interstitial, and then you press yes or no, and then then there's some UI indication that you're in off the record mode. And this is, yeah, just kind of like what we have right now. Next slide. We presented this at WebAppSec as well in W3C just to get a sense of, just to get feedback. And the feedback that we got was, it's fairly simple, and we should keep the actual considerations of what the client should do or what the user agent should do to be considerations and not be super prescriptive about that. And so offer more like suggestions than say like, this is what you should do. Yeah, and just this comparison with existing approaches like private browsing, that often overhides because you're in a session and you're like getting rid of everything there. So that leaves telltale holes in your browsing history. It's also easy to forget to start and close. I won't go through all of these, but essentially just think of the request of OTR as like an incognito mode for that website. And that website, because the website is identified as being the sensitive part. Next slide. Just the last slide, I think. Yeah, I guess like essentially interested in, maybe one more slide after this, we can just skip to that. Just really interested in what folks have to think about this. If there's interest in this, there's a 0.0 draft up.
We're at time, so
okay.
if we move to feedback, that would.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, just interested in hearing feedback. And whether this is the right place for this.
Dennis Jackson, Mozilla. I think this is interesting work. I know of time you skipped over the limitations slide. My primary concern is that this isn't as effective as private browsing, but because it's automated, might give users a false sense of security. So, you know, they go to Google, a domestic violence website, they visit the site, they get this pop-up, they hit accept, they think, job done. But in reality, that Google search is still in their history, still in their local history, and it's strictly worse than going to private browsing first and then carrying out a sequence of web sessions. So is there any way to actually, either you avoid telling the user about this, which avoids that confusion risk and keeps them focused on private browsing, but then you've got websites that don't appear in your history, you know, without your consent, or you've got this complicated user education issue, and I don't really see how you can solve it. So I guess, you know, that's my primary concern, is that this is pitched as a privacy measure that may not actually be effective and may even be actively harmful.
Yeah, that's fair. We were thinking about like certain heuristics that we could use, like remove it from you know n-1 if it's from a search engine or something. But yeah, you're right, and we've kind of documented this.
Ryan Globus. I think this is a great idea. I mean, it's definitely an additional tool to private browsing. I think it's also great for like an email app or any other apps that open the browser. It won't go to incognito on its own unless you're super careful. And I think if you're also looking for additional use cases, I think also, especially for queer folks in unfriendly environments, this is a great use case. So I'm excited about it.
Cool, thanks.
Watson Lad Akamai, I like the technology. I think it's a great application. I just wonder, why does this need to be a HTTP header as opposed to a meta tag or yeah.
Oh, it can be both, right?
Yeah, and just for me, I think this is an interesting idea. I'm just concerned, personally, not chair hat on, that you know, the issues here are mostly around privacy and the integration into the browser. And those are things that we talk about privacy here. We have privacy implications in everything we do, but you know the most connected thing of this to the HTTP working group is the fact that it's a header, and that's something that anybody can create. So that's why, to me, WebAppSec seems like you're gonna have more of the people in the room who have thought about this for a much longer time. That's just an instinct, though.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, Privacy CG Chair at the W3C. We could probably take this.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for a productive discussion. See you in Prague.
discussions.
I got dinner.